Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us for Gender Integration and the Military. I'm Stephen Ruckman, Deputy Director of the SNF Agora Institute, an academic center and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. I want to thank SNF Agora visiting fellow Grace Park for organizing today's panel, and thank our guests, Dr. Ellen Herring and Dr. Paula Thornhill, for spending their lunch hour with us to help lead this important discussion. Today's conversation will focus on women's experiences in the US Armed Forces, including opportunities for the military to make progress around gender integration. First, Grace Park, a former US Army captain, will give us a brief history of women's military achievements from the Revolutionary War until the present day. She'll then be joined by today's panelists for a discussion of the military culture around gender, the integration process so far, and the steps the US military may need to take to improve. Now, just a couple housekeeping items before I introduce today's guests. This presentation and the panel discussion will last for about 40 minutes. Then we'll take questions from the audience. Please feel welcome to submit your questions at any time during the program using the Q&A function. The moderator will choose questions to pose live to the panelists. Also, just note that the chat function has been turned off for comments so that we can use it to share relevant information among the panelists. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's guests, and I'll ask them to turn their cameras on at this time. Ellen Herring is a senior fellow at Women in International Security, where she directs the Combat Integration Initiative. She is also the former CEO of the Service Women's Action Network. Dr. Herring's research and work focuses on women and gender in the military. She's a retired US Army colonel and has taught at the US Army Command and General Staff College, the US Army War College, and Georgetown University. Paula Thornhill is acting director of the Strategic Studies program at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Prior to joining SICE, she was the director of the Strategy and Doctrine program with RAND Project Air Force. Dr. Thornhill retired from the US Air Force as a brigadier general in 2009. She's the author of the 2019 book, Demystifying the American Military. Grace Park is a former US Army captain who in 2016 was commissioned through the MIT Army ROTC program into the US Army Signal Corps. As part of their visiting fellowship at SNF Agora, they are working on a project exploring the diverse experiences of women who integrated into combat roles in the US Army, and the lessons to be drawn about when and how we succeed and fail in reaching toward the democratic values of equality, service, and shared sacrifice. Thank you again to all of our guests for joining us. And Grace, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to see everyone. I guess I can't really see everyone, but I see the panelists. I'm going to start with this presentation. It's going to be a PowerPoint, but I will keep it spicy, I promise. So, all right. All right. So here's the agenda for today. I'll start with the history, just briefly going through some of the conflicts and the women who have served bravely during those periods, and some of the bans that have existed within the military, and then post 9/11, sort of where we are, and then where we go from here. So starting with the American Revolutionary War, I do want to contextualize pretty much all the conversations that we're going to have today about women in combat. I want to make it clear that women in the US military have been serving within combat roles since the very beginning. It's just that it hasn't been in an official capacity until very, very recently. So even within the American Revolutionary War, you're looking at Nancy Morgan Hart, who impersonated a man and pretended to be a feeble-minded British soldier to gain information. And one day when 6 British soldiers came to her house and demanded that she cook them a turkey, she tricked them and poisoned them, and then actually shot one of them dead and captured the other 5. So women like her, I could spend the entire hour today just talking about women like her, even just from this one conflict. But of course, there were also women who called camp women who followed around the revolutionary troops, who acted as nurses and cooks. Following on to the Civil War, up to about 400 women were said to have disguised themselves as men and served on both sides of the Civil War. One of them, most notably, is Dr. Mary E. Walker. She was one of the first women to graduate from medical school, but she was denied a commission to become an Army surgeon. So she also disguised herself as a man and followed the Union war effort, and volunteered her skills and worked as a volunteer Army surgeon. And in fact, she was even captured by the Confederacy within her time serving. After the war, she did seek a commission and to be promoted to major. However, she was denied the ability to join for veteran status, but she was instead awarded the Medal of Honor. And she's actually still to this day the only woman to have been awarded the medal. It was, however, rescinded in 1917 when they changed the rule for the Medal of Honor to have only included people who directly engaged with the enemy. However, after she won it, she did wear it every day for the rest of her life, and I would have done that as well if I won the Medal of Honor. So we also have Susie King Taylor on the left. She was born into slavery, but learned how to read from a secret school for enslaved people. And she later went on to teach Black soldiers in the Union how to read, and also served as a nurse. And of course, these sort of there are many stories of women such as these who had a heart to serve, but were unable to do so in an official capacity, and unable to also receive the benefits of having been a veteran of these wars. So next we have the Spanish-American War, and the typhoid fever epidemic actually increased the need for nurses. And for in the first official capacity, women were allowed to serve both in the Navy and the Army. Although they weren't technically in those departments necessarily, they worked alongside the Army and the Navy as the Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps. The Army Nurse Corps was founded in 1901. The Navy nurses were appointed in 1908. And although they were commissioned as to be part of the military, they weren't awarded the same ranks or pay or benefits to their male counterparts until about the 1940s. So following on to World War I, from 1917 to 1918, women were continued not to be allowed to join the military in an official way, but they would join in these sort of specialized units. So when I served in the military, I was a signal officer. So of course I had to bring up the female telephone operators unit. These were very hardworking women who worked overseas for espionage, and also to promote the messages that were sent across enemy lines. These women were so intense about their work that there's a story about a particular unit during the Marzangan campaign who fought to continue working even when their building was on fire, and they had to be forcibly removed to stop working because they were literally going to die. But of course, these women and 35,000 other women who served in World War I as nurses or telephone operators, administrators, they weren't recognized quite as heavily for their efforts, and they still weren't legally allowed to join the military until World War II. So World War II, the war effort was so great that the military decided to include women to fill some necessary roles that they didn't have enough recruits to fill. So about 150,000 women served in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and they served in numerous capacities. These women also were not awarded the same ranks or pay or veterans benefits until the establishment of the Women's Army Corps, or the I call them the WAC. That was established after the Women's Army Service Integration Act of 1948. It's also important to note that within WAC, there was also a maximum quota for Black women who were allowed to join. So only 10% of the WAC could be filled with Black women, and these types of quotas were also used within the Nurse Corps as well. And so many highly qualified Black women were not permitted to join, even as women were gaining the right to join the military. And often they were relegated to to roles that were considered not as important, but they still fought very bravely. You can see on your right, Major Charity Adams, who was the commander of the first Black woman unit to deploy overseas, because there was also a ban on Black women to deploy. They were male operators in very dangerous combat zones as well. So following on and continuing into World War II, the necessity for more troops also allowed people like Susan Ann Cuddy, the first Asian American naval officer, to join the WAC, and she was actually the first female gunnery officer at all in the U.S. Navy. On your right, there were also people like Virginia Hall, who served she had lost her leg early in life, and originally was not allowed to join the Foreign Service because people who were disabled were not allowed to join. So she petitioned and was able to join. She was fluent in French and German and became a prolific spy. And this is a photo of her receiving the Distinguished Service Cross for her efforts. So, and within the Korean War and beyond, that's when the Air Force was finally established. Before, it had been part of the Army as the Army Air Corps. And so Esther McGowan Blake, you see on your left, she was actually the first woman to join the Women's Air Force, or Women in the Air Force, the WAF, as it was called. As soon as it would open, she immediately enlisted. And you'll see on your right, actually, that the Women's Medical Unit, evacuation unit, was the only unit allowed in the combat zone in Korea. So despite the advances of women, there were still many barriers for women to join in official capacities. But others still did serve overseas, though not in the combat zone in Korea, as air traffic controllers, as radio operators, and weather observers. And it should be noted that Truman's 1948 act also integrated white and Black troops at this time. So going into the various bans and movements that have occurred to enable equality within the military. As I said, 1948, Truman signed Executive Order 9981. And actually, until 1960, there wasn't an official ban on transgender people in the military. Of course, that was lifted by the Obama administration and then reinstated in 2017. And it's currently lifted in the Biden administration. But because it's not in law, it can continue to be sort of waffled back and forth. There are some landmark cases that have documented the struggle for transgender people, including transgender women. And Doe versus Alexander in 1981 is one of those major cases. And the combat exclusion policy that we'll be discussing in detail today actually came about in 1994, which in part opened many positions to women, but also banned women from serving in combat capacities, both in supporting combat units like I did when I was in the military, or being a combat arms officer, as women are allowed to now. And in 2012, the Service Women's Action Network, SWAN for short, sued the Department of Defense in order to overturn this policy. Dr. Herring was a key component of that, and I'm excited to hear from her today. Post 9/11, we've seen a lot of advancements. In 2013. Female service members were able to serve in combat units in support roles, again, like I did. 2015, Special Operations is open to women. And you can see on the top right, Captain Grice and Lieutenant Haver were the first women to pass the Army Ranger School. And in 2015, that's also when the exclusion rule was lifted. In 2016, all military occupations are open, and the first class of women infantry and armor officers graduated basic officer leader course. And actually, some of those officers are here with us today in the audience. So thank you for your service. And yeah, from here. There are obviously still issues that women face within the military that we'll be happy to discuss. Some of these enduring barriers are high rates of sexual assault and harassment in the workplace. Although the military has made more efforts to curb these high rates of assault and harassment, the culture still remains pretty difficult for women in the military. Another issue that women face are improperly fitting gear and equipment. This isn't just oversized, shirts or uniforms. This includes life-saving equipment like plate carriers and Kevlar vests, or even helmets that, if they aren't fitted perfectly, will be very dangerous for people who do deploy overseas. There are also healthcare benefits to both veterans and active duty soldiers, given that the medical needs of women and men are sometimes different, and the general cultural and social barriers that stop people from joining or stop people from being able to fully integrate or to build a community within their military units. So from here we'll go into the discussion with Dr. Thornhill and Dr. Herring. And so these are some of the references you can take a look at later on if you're interested. But otherwise, we'll switch over then to the panelist portion. So stop this share. Okay. So Dr. Thornhill, Dr. Herring, thank you so much for joining us today. As we've seen, both of you had such illustrious careers, and we're so excited to hear more about it. If I could start with just a basic question of when you commissioned, when you joined, what was the perception of women like, and what made you decide to join?
Ellen, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for doing this, Grace, today. It's very exciting to be here. I joined in, I enlisted first in 1979. Women were less than 10% of the force at that time. And I enlisted as an effort because I was interested in educational benefits. Ultimately, I used those educational benefits to go to West Point where I graduated in 1984. I think the big draw for me from the military was education, but also it was an education kind of with a twist or with an exciting twist. I looked at it as an adventure. So it was the adventure and the educational benefits that drew me to the military at that time.
So my story is kind of similar. I would say, Grace, one thing you could put on your slides is the reason I actually joined the military was because they opened up the service academies to women. So I was in the class of 1980 at the Air Force Academy. They opened them up to women. They opened the academies up to women in legislation in 75, and first class entered in 76. And it was literally that decision at 17 years old was what put me into the military. So that's it.
Wow, that's incredible. So you were among the first women to graduate from, both academies. What was your experience at the academies like?
So I'll start and then hand it back. The academies were confused, right? They're trying to integrate. They don't want women there. This is the mid 70s. You have to think about it holistically about where the military was in the mid 70s, post Vietnam. Only losers joined the military in the 70s to begin with, and then because the women couldn't join combat arms. Due to legislative exclusions. They prepared because they were told to prepare. But I would say, at least my experience at the Air Force Academy, is we were not wholeheartedly embraced. And I would bet that was true at West Point too.
Yes, it was certainly the case. And I came along 5 years after you, and I'll say that 5 years later, it wasn't much better. Although I'm sure the very first class had it the hardest. I would say that actually after we graduated, I had a better experience of the Army. I was a signal officer also than I did of the academy at that time. I think that the Army was more accepting, the general purpose Army was more accepting, especially in the branch that I went, which already had women. And signal or communications, women had a long standing, as you just detailed, in the kind of communications area. So we weren't all that unusual, although we were still a significant minority, even in the signal branch.
I see. So I was wondering how within your careers then, have you seen the shift or the integration of women through both the Air Force and the Army?
You broke out on my end. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So I was wondering, in your experience, starting from your academy experience to joining the Air Force and the Army, how the perception of women and their acceptance within the ranks has changed.
Ellen, you get to go first. Grace, you might want to call one of us out, or outside of that, we'll.
That's a good idea. I'll do that.
So I would say as much as things change, they stay the same, would be my response to that, unfortunately. My own daughter joined the Army many years after I did. Many of the same experiences that I had, she had, and they weren't necessarily positive ones. And I work with many young women who are now in the Army, and they are still facing the same kind of absurd sexism that we faced 20, 30 years ago. I will say the one thing that's changed, though, is that there are more women now. So we were roughly, in my graduating class at West Point, 8 to 10% of the class. Now it's well over 20%. I think the Air Force Academy is up over 25% now. So the numbers have more than doubled. And I do hope that there will be a time, a tipping point eventually, where women will no longer be seen as an anomaly and will not experience the same kind of sexism and discrimination that they still continue to face today, at least in the Army. The Air Force, I hear, is better.
So the way I answer questions like this is, first of all, I do it from the perspective of a teacher, right? And also from a perspective of a retiree. The only military you know is the military you served in. All the other militaries that have come since I retired in 2009, I know people in them. I know them well. I've talked to them a lot, but it is not the military that I served in. And so I interpolate through those lenses. And that's just an important caveat to have. I think one of the things that we do have to credit the military with is a more robust conversation now than certainly we had in the mid 1970s and the early 1980s. And going back to the academy experience, we didn't even have the language of sexism, of sexual harassment, of sexual assault, all of that. We didn't even have the language to identify problems. So especially when you're teenagers in an environment like that, you don't even know if what's happening is right or wrong, because it is all you know. We have made unbelievable progress by those criteria, you know, in an empirical sense since the 1970s. Is there more to be done? You know, all I can do is echo what Ellen said. Of course there is, because this is a journey for all of us.
So Dr. Thornhill, you were talking about how there wasn't really a language to talk about it. At what point did you sort of realize what you're experiencing was sexism, and how did you deal with the sexism that you faced in the Air Force?
So I need to answer those questions in two different ways. The first answer, in terms of especially understanding the academy experience, the first time that actually happened was at our 10-year reunion. When the women, so there's a longer story than we have time for how women were integrated at the Air Force Academy. But one of the things that it did was it created a very cohesive, very tight group, because of the way that we were isolated at different points in time. And we all started talking 10 years later at our reunion, and we're like, hey, did this happen to you? Yeah, it happened to me. You know, I'm still a little miffed about that. And it was one of these things that turned into sort of a group therapy session, right? Where you're all talking about, well, that was wrong. Yeah, how did that happen? So that's when we began to realize that some things, not all things, that happened there were inappropriate. There were a lot of positives as well that we shouldn't lose sight of. When it comes to my career, I would say that even though I ran into several of the issues, and fundamentally the issue that I ran into was the limitation in career choices. But I will say that I also had terrific mentors along the way, to a person, male mentors, because there just weren't that many women serving at the time.
Oh, that community sounds really important for you to have continue to advance in your Air Force career. Dr. Herring, I was wondering if you could also discuss how you managed the sexism that you experienced in the Army.
I think that my response would be, and I've never thought of it this way, Paula, is similar to yours. I don't think we had the language to call it out for what it was. And in fact, I would say that there are still women that have the same experiences that I had and wouldn't call it sexism or sexual harassment. So I do think there is some degree of education and also some degree of what you're willing to tolerate in terms of treatment. Some people, we've talked similar to Paula, I've talked to classmates of mine, we had the same experience and one person didn't process it the way another person processed it. So, you know, they wouldn't be offended by something that somebody else says, that was clear sexism. And it's kind of, I think it's an educational process. But yeah, I just think that you make a good observation, Paul, in terms of we didn't have the language and when did we have the language? I think that the language has developed really relatively recently to be able to even call out what's happening, what happens, you know, that isolation, marginalization, then there's which is like low levels of harassment. And it's not even overt harassment. It's just exclusion, which is kind of painful. But then the more overt, the, you know, nasty words said to you, the intentional belittling, those kinds of things, which is sexism. And people don't even know when or how to call it out that way.
Yeah, Dr. Herring, I do want to call back to how you're saying some of these issues that you faced are some of the issues that women who are integrating now still face. I was wondering if you could discuss your research project a little bit on the first class of infantry and armor officers you interviewed.
Sure. So in 2016, when the first group of women were just starting their training in the infantry and the armor branches, we went to Fort Benning where they were training. And we invited them to take part in a longitudinal study where our intent was we would interview them over 5 years, track their progress, and see how things were changing. And also, we were just trying to document their experiences from a historical perspective, because in many cases, when these previous integration efforts happened, there was no, I mean, I've tried to look back at the academy integration process, and there just isn't any good material to look at. There's certainly no interviews of the women that were going through it at the time. So we have been interviewing them for this is our 5th year. We just completed the 5th year of interviews. The first year was 2016, and we kind of characterized 2016 as the hopeful expectations year. We interviewed them in training and at school, and they were all very excited about they knew that they had a sense of their historical perspective in the military and in the Army in particular. The second year we described as, we kind of have labeled each year as we've looked back at the interviews as hitting a brick wall. Now they're out in the force, they're out in their unit, they're in infantry and armor units, and they were not well received. Many of them struggled that first year. We had we sent quite a few of the 22 that we've been working with to see therapists, and that helped to some degree, but nobody else was advising them to do that. It was us in our interview process, and we heard about their struggles, and we said, you all need to reach out for additional help. And so they did. Oh, many of them did. The third year, we have titled Resigned Acceptance. They kind of have resigned themselves to, this is where I am, I'm stuck here for a while, because most of them, they're all officers, and they had either 3, 4, or 5 year commitments that they had to serve. So by year 3, they're kind of resigned to where they are, and they're starting to get their feet on the ground. By year 4, quite a few of them have left the Army. Of our original 22, 4, they've either left the Army altogether by year 4, or they've rebranched out of the combat arms. So 6 of our original 22 had resigned altogether and were pursuing other careers. 4 had left the ground combat units. Of that original 22, we had 5 that had been injured to the point where they required surgeries. 1 had been diagnosed with cancer. 2 had been sexually assaulted and had reported their assaults. And to varying degree, they all reported varying degrees of sexual harassment to us, as well as the 2 that were sexually assaulted. And these are officers, lieutenants, and now they're captains. So they've had a struggle. But I would say that after year 4, when what we called moving on, year 5, we've looked back at the interviews now with year 5, and we're calling them new beginnings and success against all odds. Because of the 10 that have actually left, rebranched, or gone to become civilians, that's new beginnings for them. They're doing something brand new. And of the women that have stayed, we call it success against all odds, because they are successful, most of them. And they are, charting a new path for women in the military.
Um, I'm particularly interested in the people you've said who've succeeded. What do you think was sort of different about those women, or maybe what was different about them that allowed them to succeed?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't really studied it that closely. I can say that, we haven't done like a methodological analysis of it. I think off the top of my head, the ones that I think have succeeded the most were ones that had high levels of, well, first of all, very mature for their age. Although some of them were older in particular because they were rebranching from other branches. So Combat Arms opened up. They said, I've always wanted to be Combat Arms, and they came in from another branch. We've got some that came from, had been MPs or field artillery. So if they had experience in the Army, it seems like that helped. The other ones who were younger, they just were more mature than the average soldier, and they were able to kind of look at the playing field and figure out where they fit and figure out how to navigate that. High levels of emotional intelligence from the most successful women also. And of course, fitness. You cannot succeed in the military, but most particularly in the Combat Arms, unless you can maintain a high level of physical fitness. And all of them have done that.
I see. Dr. Thornhill, would you chime in here to give your perspective about women in the Air Force? Would you say a lot of those things are true also for women who are able to succeed in the Air Force?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think you could take those qualities and you could translate them right across. And I think that this, one of the points that we really need to explore is, and it goes back to the point about physical fitness and how we understand what the military's role is, right? Because one of the things, and this is going beyond gender, this is going into, my guess is everybody that is participating in this event today has a different concept of what the military is and should be, and to what extent it ties back to what Ellen was very much describing, which is a physical application of organized violence, and what you have to be able to do to both employ that violence and then to be able to subject yourself to it, right? That's a very different military from the type of military that you would talk about, say, somebody joining the Space Force. And so actually how we understand and conceptualize the military, I think, is part of what we really need to think about holistically, and then next down into especially what was being described when it comes to land forces. The expectations on land forces they're just different.
I see. I think it's really interesting that you bring up the Space Force and sort of where we're headed. There's a big push now to fill the roles in the Space Force, and they're taking from all services. So I was wondering, like looking ahead, what steps you think the military of all branches should be taking to achieve gender equality for women. And I think Dr. Thornhill, you can start, and then we'll have Dr. Herring chime in afterwards.
So where I come down on this, let's see, it would be, it does not fit into established policy, right? My view is that we have taken, my view number one is something like the Space Force shouldn't exist. Not because it's not important, it's very important, but it is not a military service. And a military service to me is an organization that has a responsibility for the actual management, mastery, and application of organized violence. When people are fighting and dying in space, then there should be a Space Force. Before that, it's a defense agency, it's a support agency, it's something like that. So I think that we can never forget what it is and why it is that we create a military, and then start thinking about what's the best way to talent manage to get the best folks possible, regardless of gender, regardless of age, regardless of all of those, of all those factors, get the right person in the right place at the right time to do what is right for the nation. And I think the more broadly you define the military, the more you tend to dilute what it is that you're asking it to do specifically when it becomes to its responsibility for organized violence.
That's a really good point about the role of the military and including the Space Force. Dr. Herring, I was wondering if you had anything to add, especially in where you think the military should be headed in terms of gender equality.
Well, I think one of the things that the military has never done relative to, and yes, you've called this gender equality. I would say it's women's integration. But yes, gender equality is where what we'd like to see. But I would say that the military has never really adapted itself to allow women to succeed. Instead, it has said, women, if you can figure out what we do, then you might be successful. So some of the things that we've struggled with is with this organizational change or an accommodation of women. Everything in the military is designed to fit and to cater to the average man. There's never been any effort to actually accommodate and include women. For example, as you've already pointed out, Grace, there's never been any focus on women's uniforms and equipment that would facilitate better training or outcomes for women. The uniforms that have been adapted for women are largely what they look like uniforms, our ceremonial uniforms. It's not the combat gear that we wear in conflict environments. So I think that one of the things that the military has to do is consider themselves, we've got a male and a female, or across the gender spectrum. And consider all the people that they have in the military, rather than just continue to focus on this male core, and everybody else has to figure out how to fit into that this kind of standard model. So if the military can ever get beyond this kind of masculine male model and include everyone else, then I think we'd have some progress.
I think this actually segues nicely into one of the audience questions. So one of the audience members have asked, as women assume leadership positions in the military post-integration, what has helped to set a different tone in organizations, in units? So I think we can start with you, Dr. Herring.
Oh, gosh. Well, first of all, it's very hard for women to make any change at this point, and most of them are adapting to the existing model. If you do anything that's different, you're seen as not succeeding. So at this point, women are, largely adapting to the model that they've been raised on, which is a male masculine model. I hope that as they become more senior and they have a little bit more latitude in what they can do, that they do kind of change or shift the the focus, the perspective of the military. But right now, there's still such small numbers, at least in the combat arms, well, even across the force. I mean, in the Army, women are only about 17 to 18% of the force. That's not a tipping point by any stretch of the imagination. So we've got a long ways to go.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts. Dr. Thornhill, would you concur?
I think the points are excellent. I think there's the larger point to me to build on what was just said is We have a larger issue in the country with propensity to serve, and I'm sure you all have looked at these numbers. The propensity for men to serve isn't very high. The propensity for women to serve is even lower. And so part of addressing these larger issues is figuring out a way where we're actually tapping into a larger pool of folks who are willing to serve and to bring those attitudes and that maturity into the force. And that all of these other issues become, to me, sort of a subset of that. The more we get the military to look like America, the more we can actually then shape some of these behaviors.
I think that's a strong point. I think this type of argument comes up when talking about selective service, about the, women aren't included in the draft currently. But there is a big argument to say that women should not be drafted into the military when it's such a hostile environment for women, and only has just begun to sort of adjust into accepting women of all body types and abilities. So I was wondering what your perspective was on selective service and women joining. Dr. Thornhill, it seems like your perspective might be that women should be included in selective service.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of these until there's a recognition that however you conceive of the national defense and the providing for the national defense, until there's a recognition that this is a citizen's responsibility, you are already creating barriers and issues. Another thing which is tangential but might be of interest to the participants. When I ask my students, who I think are terrific, have you considered the military? By and large, the answer will be, and this is anecdotal, not empirical, right? But the answer I most frequently get is, my mom doesn't want me to join. And it turns out that when you look at the empirical data, that the role that mothers play in whether or not folks decide to join the military is profound. Another reason to have the draft include both men and women, or all genders.
You're nodding your head, Dr. Herring. Would you agree?
100% agree that women should be included in selective service. First of all, neither men nor women want to be drafted. Men don't want to be drafted either. This isn't something they get a choice about. It absolutely ties to citizenship and acceptance. It's a citizen duty and responsibility. I personally think selective service should go away. I don't support the selective service in general, but if we're going to make men register, then certainly women should register.
So, okay. I think this is a bigger conversation that I feel like we could spend the rest of our time talking about. So I did want to get to some more of the audience questions. Dr. Herring, this one is for you from Lucy Perkins. From some people say that reserve and guard units are more relaxed and collegial environments than active duty because service members have experienced the civilian workplace. Have you found that guard combat units have had better integration experiences than active duty?
No, just the opposite.
Oh, really?
Yes. So we had, 3 guard women in our original study. All 3 of them have left the ground combat arms. There are 3 of the, 4 that have rebranched out. I would say just the opposite. Guard units tend to be very insular. They're controlled within their states. The combat units within them are smaller. And my experience with the 3 guard women, all 3 of them left within a couple of years because they were such targets. And there wasn't any place for them to go. Unlike active duty, where you can rotate to another unit, you're not going to be here permanently. These guard units, you're stuck there. One of the women, she's a tanker. She was in the West Virginia National Guard, and she didn't want to stop being a tanker. So she's actually now in the North Carolina National Guard. She found a more hospitable environment than the guard unit where she was at. So no, and in fact, we've done a lot of at the Service Women's Action Network some work with a number of people on guard units relative to sexual assault and harassment, where you have high rates and very low prosecution rates, simply because they aren't overseen by big Army. They don't necessarily comply with Army-wide policies, and they answer to their state adjutant generals and their governors.
I think it's an interesting point you bring up about the sexual assault cases and the lack of prosecution. We do have an anonymous question about the continuing violence against women within the military. Most notably, I'm not sure if you've heard of the Vanessa Guillen case back in 2020 from Fort Hood. Yeah.
Yes.
And the question is like, what do we think about that case and what it reveals about the military? I would say that that case demonstrated bigger issues within the unit, and Fort Hood, of course, has it's like an infamous base within the military of just what it garrison the Army in particular. And I can't really speak necessarily as much to the Navy or the Air Force, but of like a culture of just like hypermasculinity and how it can sort of bubble over into violence within the troops. So yeah, this one's for Dr. Thornhill. I don't know if you're familiar with that case at all, and what your perspective on it was.
I am familiar with the case. Obviously, my reaction to anything like that is it's just a huge failure. It's a failure on so many levels. It's a failure on a criminal level. It's a failure on a command level. It's a failure in terms of creating an effective fighting force when it comes to the issues of integration. And frankly, it would not surprise me at all. And I find my position on this changing if military law and military discipline isn't removed from the hands of the commanders. And I think that the case is there to do that. And that is a huge sea change for me personally, to say I think the time has come to do that.
Yeah, Dr. Herring, it seems like you also agree with Dr. Thornhill's perspective on that.
Absolutely, I agree with it. Many of the interviews we've conducted in the last 5 years happened at Fort Hood, especially in this first year 2 and year 3 were largely at Fort Hood. And we heard these horrific stories from these women. I personally called brigade combat team commanders, 06 command level leaderships and their command sergeant majors, and told them what was happening to these women, especially the enlisted women. And I got very, they listened, they seemed sympathetic. And then the response was to call the women in and ask the women, what's going on. And they were all pretty mute. Once they're sitting there in front of their 06 commander and command sergeant majors, they don't want to talk much. And nothing came out of our repeated reports to senior leadership at Fort Hood and to the Army at large. And then in 2017, while we were still doing this research, RAND published a study about where's the worst place for sexual harassment and assault in the military. And the number 1 place in the Army was Fort Hood, Texas, in that report. I think that a whole slew of Fort Hood leadership should have been relieved over that. And then the worst thing is we have Vanessa Guillen's murder and death, and it was just horrific. And then the subsequent way they failed to really follow up in the ways that they should have. They relieved 17 people, but they didn't even relieve the post commander. They relieved a bunch of enlisted guys and a few lower level commanders. And this is not a problem unique or special at Fort Hood, although Fort Hood is probably emblematically the worst.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that that characterization. It does, and I think the Army's reaction to anything sort of bad or bad publicity is always to just relieve a bunch of people, and that's we figured it out, guys. But that's not necessarily the cultural change that Dr. Thornhill was talking about in terms of changing the culture or the policies within the military to take the power of certain commanders to charge. I'm forgetting the word, but the ability to charge soldiers. I think it segues into Katie Gaffney's question about keeping integration sort of relevant. It seems like there are a lot of units who have integrated and think that they're done and that's it without following up. So this is for you, Ellen, or Dr. Herring. Katie says, in regards to hitting the brick wall, she's currently in a combat support role in an infantry battalion, and she wants to know how we can keep integration relevant. So the women 11 Bravos and 18 Bravos, when they first integrated, were paid special attention to, but now that it's 2021, the brigade is now saying, well, women are here now, we don't have to worry about them, but she disagrees, especially based on SHARP statistics, SHARP being the sexual harassment and rape prevention program in the Army, and the number of women leaving the military. So what do you think of that, Ellen?
I 100% agree with her. And same thing happened with the academies when the first women got there. It was like after the first 5 years, they kind of stopped paying attention. It was like, oh, done with that. We're all good to go. And in fact, we still aren't where we need to be. How do we keep it relevant? Well, what I would suggest to women that are currently serving, they do things like join advocacy organizations like the Service Women's Action Network. We keep these, we're pushing them to DOD, but we also have a direct line to members of Congress where we push for legislation that will change policies and laws. We've also engaged in a number of lawsuits that have challenged policies. In particular, the Service Women's Action Network has an open lawsuit right now against the Department of Defense over a policy that was established with the full integration of women into ground combat units. The policy was, we're going to do what they call it leaders first. We're going to put the leaders first, and then every unit that has enlisted women has to have a certain number of leaders. Well, what it's done is trapped junior women leaders into units that then they only feed enlisted women. So then you've got units that only have women, then you've got these units that have no women at all. And our lawsuit is challenging both the Leaders First policy that's been in place in both the Marine Corps and the Army. And we're also challenging this ongoing problem in the Marine Corps of segregating men and women during basic training. So advocacy organizations that support you and raise these issues to the national level, I think that's one way to keep it in the dialogue. But I will say that I think the Army, with the Fort Hood mess, and more recently with the new administration's focus on ending sexual harassment and assault in the military with this new commission, they have appointed a number of people who are studying and working on this. So it hasn't been forgotten, certainly hasn't been forgotten by people like me who are now analyzing this data, writing reports. I was working on an op-ed about the new Army combat fitness test right while we were waiting to join this today, to challenge that. So, but if you're serving, it's hard to be kind of the squeaky wheel, because you don't want to draw attention to yourself as the only woman in the unit.
Dr. Thornhill, would you agree with Dr. Herring's view of that?
I would. I think that the only asterisk I would put on it is, and I would say this is important for all who serve, and I'm especially thinking of the officer ranks, is write and publish while you are on active duty, right? And that is hard, but some of this, part of the way that you get the force to reckon with what's going on is you actually have the courage to put something out there that folks are compelled to respond to. And I'm thinking about some of the pieces that I've read recently, and they can be very powerful. And a captain or a major can reach their service chief or combatant commander through the power of those writings. And I would encourage folks to think of that. And it does take courage. Back to what Ellen's point was, it takes a huge amount of courage, but it's your force, right? And sometimes if you don't do it, who's going to do it?
We have another question about, actually, for new recruits and like the training and curriculum. This is for either of you. Are there elements or changes to the training or curriculum that have been effective in changing the culture to be more inclusive that you all know of?
I don't know of anything. In fact, one of my, as I was prepping for this also, one of the questions that you all sent was, what has the Army done to make this, integration go better? And unfortunately, I think the only thing they've done is what they were required by Congress to do, which was to set occupational standards, to set clearly defined, measurable occupational standards so that they weren't like a mystery about what you had to do to qualify to be an infantry or armor soldier. So they've set standards. Women can clearly meet them. Yeah, I think that, but I don't know beyond, setting these standards and putting them out there in terms of the basic qualification courses. I know that the women that have gone through it got no training on how they were supposed to integrate these units. And they've been given little to no resources on how to deal with challenges they face. Also, the male leadership that was tasked with integrating these units received zero training on how do we lead a gender integrated force. So yeah, there hasn't been much training changes that I'm aware of. Of course, I haven't gone through these programs myself recently in a long time.
Dr. Thornhill, do you have anything to add?
The only thing that I know of that I think the answer's spot on is this is an area where there's a lot of research. I know RAND's done a lot of research. I'm sure other FFRDCs have done it. This is the difference between an organizations and probably thinking of services or maybe even subsets of that. Thinking whether or not they are broke enough or if they have a bad enough problem that they need to respond to the research. And sometimes it takes something more catastrophic, which is sad, but that's sometimes how organizations respond.
I see. I think that's actually all the time we have for questions. I was wondering if you all had any closing statements that you'd like to give prior to signing off.
Go ahead, Paula.
Yeah, the one thing I would say, especially to the participants who are listening, is this, and if you are serving right now, this is your military, and I see progress and I see attitudes in your military I did not see in my military. And I would seize that and I would hold on to it and recognize that you're the key.
So yeah, and I would like to end with on a high note or a positive, because I feel like a lot of my comments have been kind of negative. One of the things we asked the women on our ground combat study is, would you do it again? And 100% of them say, yes, I'd do it again. They feel like even if they had a bad experience, they learned a lot about themselves, about the military, about other people, and none of them would give it up, their experiences, even the ones that are been injured and medically discharged.
Thank you for that perspective. I think it's a positive note to end on. Thank you for joining. Before I hand it back over to Stephen to end it, I did want to answer Jamin's question, Jamin Gelbach, where they asked, wasn't Virginia Hall posing as a milk deliverer? And it's true. Virginia Hall was the one-legged spy during World War I. Or two. And she actually dyed her hair gray and pretended to be a milkmaid in order to ask people for intelligence, and was never caught. So yeah, on that note, I'll hand it over to Stephen. Thank you all for your questions. And
thank you, Grace, and thank you, Drs. Thornhill and Herring, for joining us today. What a great discussion. We all learned so much. And as you put it well, Dr. Thornhill, the more we can get the military to look like America, the more we can get the military to shape positive change. So thank all three of you for your service to our country and the ways you have modeled a more inclusive future for our military. And of course, thank you to our audience for all of your great questions and for your engagement today. We would love to invite you to join us on April 29th at 6 p.m. for another event with our visiting fellow Grace Park, where they will share their year-long research and analysis of in-depth interviews with the officers who in 2017 became the first women in US military history to join the infantry and armor branches. Park's research explores the trials, tribulations, and victories of those pioneering women and what their experiences mean for the US military in the years to come. You can find more information about that event and other upcoming events at snfagora.ghu.edu or click on the link posted in the chat. We hope you'll join us for these conversations and others in the future. And you can also sign up for our bi-monthly e-newsletter by clicking the link in this chat. I would be remiss if I didn't encourage you to do that. And finally, a recording of this conversation will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel in the coming days. So check back soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.